What's up guys? Welcome back to my YouTube channel, and if you are new here, then welcome. My name is Beth, and in today's video I'm going to be sharing with you guys all about my breastfeeding journey and experience as a first-time mom. My struggles with low supply, kind of the things I wish I knew before I started breastfeeding my daughter, what I'm going to do differently with my second baby, and all of that fun stuff. So if any of that sounds interesting to you, then just keep on watching. So before I gave birth to my daughter, I feel like I looked into everything, like postpartum, what you do with a baby after you have them, like birth, all of this stuff. But for some reason, breastfeeding is one of those things that I didn't really look into. I didn't research it. I didn't talk to my other mom friends about it. I kind of just assumed that it would be something that would come really naturally, biologically. And so I didn't put a lot of just like thought into it in general. And that was definitely naive of me. I kind of wish that I had maybe even watched some videos like this, or just put a little bit more thought into it, because when I did start breastfeeding, it was definitely over the course of the 9 months that I was able to exclusively breastfeed my daughter, which I am grateful for. A definitely like emotionally and physically and mentally a challenging experience, even though it was still so beautiful and such a wonderful bond, all kind of wrapped up in one. And so this is my experience. It is very vulnerable. I feel like a lot of the people that watch my channel maybe got glimpses into this as I talked about like low supply while I was dealing with it, but I haven't really ever sat down and shared my story. I kind of wanted to wait until I had weaned my baby to do that, and so I'm just gonna lay it all out on the table for you guys today. First disclaimer that I want to give out here is that when it comes to feeding your baby, in my opinion, fed is best. It doesn't matter whether that is breast milk, it doesn't matter whether that is formula, whether that is donated milk. Your baby being fed and your mental health are what are most important. So just off of the hop, I want to just give that disclaimer there. Of course, I want you guys to be able to share your story and kind of thoughts in the comments as well. But if you do choose to do that, then make sure you do it from just a loving place, knowing that everyone's situation and experience with this will be different. So just want to get that out of the way first. So right off the bat, after I had my daughter, she actually did latch really well, which I was very happy with. And again, that was all that I had really planned for. So luckily she did have a good latch. I did experience quite a bit of like nipple pain and just chapped nipples and just pain with that. And towards the end of this, I'll share like some of my products and tips to kind of help overcome that. But my daughter did latch really well, which was awesome. The people at the hospital were like, looks good. But I was definitely very, very anxious in the first 2 days after having her that she was getting enough. So if you didn't know this, your milk typically doesn't really come in until a couple of days after birth. I think some of the soonest times that people see it is like 1 day after. In my case, my milk didn't come in for 2 days after I had my daughter. So when I was feeding her at the colostrum and trying to even just like hand express some of it to get it ready for her, I was just so nervous and kind of like a little bit panicked. And I think that that came with a lot of that just postpartum hormonal like changes and things like that. But I was so anxious that she wasn't getting enough food. And so one of my friends who is actually a nurse just recommended, like, if it would help you feel a little bit better, why don't you get formula and just have it in the house as a backup in case. And at this point, I probably like didn't even need to do that because it was so early into it, but I ended up doing it just as a backup to have it in the house. And doing that was the first kind of moment that I experienced a lot of the, I guess, like mom guilt or some of the shame that I had put on myself for even considering to use formula or to do anything other than breastfeed. So fast forward those 2 days after having her, my breast milk finally came in and I was super engorged. Because I was so engorged, I actually had to hand express a lot of that milk or pump to get rid of it. So I would have all of this milk coming out, like my whole shirt would be soaked, and then I would just throw a lot of those disposable nipple pads out afterwards, and I wouldn't actually save any of the milk. So I was kind of just like pumping and dumping a lot of this stuff, or we would put it in the fridge and then just forget to freeze it. And so I remember just being like, oh my gosh, there's so much of this. And my husband just kept saying like, this is like not his fault because he didn't know, but he was like, it's not a finite resource, like don't worry about like saving it all, it's okay, like your body will make more. Eventually I did get to a point where I realized that like how much I had been emptying the milk out was kind of signaling to my body that I needed to feed like twins or something with the supply and demand. And so my husband and I were like, okay, let's just like slowly wean off of the pump and find other ways to kind of relieve the pain, whether that is heating pads or cooling or whatever. And so I ended up just kind of weaning off of that and just focusing on feeding my baby. And luckily, a lot of that engorgement did stop once I slowed down on actually emptying the milk out. Beyond that point, which I would say was like week 2 or 3 into breastfeeding, I actually felt like I started to really get into a rhythm with it. I found that I was getting a lot more comfortable with kind of positioning her and all of those different things, and my boobs didn't hurt as much anymore, which was amazing. So the experience actually got really great for me at that point. However, at just 6 weeks postpartum, my period came back with vengeance, and I was getting it every single month. In terms of like how long I would get it for or when I would get it for was still kind of like regulating, but I did get one every single month, and it didn't seem like breastfeeding was impacting my body's ability to get a period back whatsoever. The first thing that I noticed when my period came back, and I didn't necessarily make the connection at that point, but I noticed that my letdown was starting to get a lot slower, and this was around like the 3 or 4 month mark. So for anyone that might not know what a letdown is, really quickly, if your baby latches and latches well, typically you would be signaling to your body that milk is needed, the baby is here to eat, and so your body would release the milk from the glands to feed the baby. Some people experience a feeling with that. I did. It was like a tingling feeling, sometimes an almost like painful feeling. Well, not painful, but just like uncomfortable and almost like a warmness. I would get the tingling literally up into my armpit. Like, it was such a bizarre feeling. I know some people that don't feel anything at all with it, but I always did have a feeling, and that didn't go away anytime in my breastfeeding journey. For 9 months, when I got a letdown, I had a feeling with it. But that feeling used to come immediately, like after my daughter would get a good latch beforehand. And then after I got my period, I noticed that it would take a lot longer for that to happen. So at first it was like, okay, it's taking like 2 to 3 minutes to get a good letdown. And then after that, it would start to take like 5 minutes. And then at its peak, like the worst of after I got my period back, it would be like sometimes 10 to 15 minutes of her latching and unlatching and latching and unlatching and getting so frustrated and screaming and crying and myself crying, and I just couldn't get that letdown to happen. At this point, I started to feel a lot of anxiety when it came to breastfeeding, and I remember before, like every single nursing session that would come up, I would just be dreading it because I knew that she would be so upset not being able to get the milk out fast enough. I felt like my body had just started failing me out of nowhere, and that was really hard for me because I had set a goal personally for myself to breastfeed for at least 12 months, and then at this point, it was like, okay, I'm only like 3 or 4 months into this. Like, is my new goal just gonna be 6 months? Will I even be able to make it to 6 months? And so I just like felt so much anxiety around it. Just felt like, again, I was failing her, I was failing myself, and it was just a really dark time. So obviously I started looking into all of the different ways to improve my letdown, to improve milk supply in general. I started Googling, I started watching YouTube videos, I started talking to my mom friends, and I heard a lot of the same refrain from all of those places of drink more water, make sure you're not missing any meals, and maybe just snack more. Eat oatmeal when you wake up in the morning. Drink the mother's milk tea. Try hand expressing before. Try herbal tinctures. Try power pumping. And basically, I started doing all of these things religiously every single day, and before feeding, the anxiety would pick up again, and if I didn't notice that any of these things were helping, I would just start to feel that like tightness in my chest and that just sickness in my stomach of like, I am failing my daughter. While I was experiencing all of this, my supply never dried up completely, but it was always like just enough, if not like slightly a little bit too little for her. Honestly, like at that 3 and 4 month like mark with her, I was crying multiple times a day about breastfeeding. And that was honestly I'm trying not to cry. I'm also pregnant right now and hormonal, but it was a really dark time for me. I was like losing weight drastically because I was so stressed out about this. A lot of it obviously did have to do with like postpartum, but I lost all of my baby weight, which was like 35 pounds, like probably within the first month and a half to 2 months after having her. But within like 4 to 6 weeks, I lost another 10 pounds just being so stressed out about feeding her and making sure she had enough. And like my family members were noticing, my friends were noticing, like, you're losing a lot of weight. And I was just taking on so much unnecessary stress and just like pressure to make this work. Okay. I think like 2 months of this anxiety went by before I decided I was going to contact that lactation consultant that I had kind of seen in the beginning again and just chat with her and let her know what I was experiencing. And what we decided to focus on in those sessions was the slow letdown specifically. So she actually told me it's very unlikely that this is your supply being too low. It seems like the issue is the slow letdown. That could be from the stress, it could be from the anxiety, so let's focus on that. So what she recommended basically was more skin to skin, trying to just have like more joy in my day, more time for myself, more time to breathe, and just kind of like let a lot of this anxiety go. Even looking at photos of the baby when I was trying to pump or things like that while she was napping. Basically all of these different things that you'll often hear when it comes to focusing on a slow letdown specifically. I tried some of the things that she recommended for probably a week and a half, but was noticing absolutely no change in my letdown and was still really struggling to get my milk to come out at each feeding. And so I kind of went back to her and I said, look, I think we need to go a little bit deeper here. I think that the issue could actually be hormonal. And so we decided to look into that as well. So it turned out that the issues with my letdown and my supply were linked to and correlated with my menstrual cycle. And essentially my body wasn't creating enough of the hormone prolactin. So prolactin is the hormone that is in your pituitary glands that causes your breast to make milk. And when you are someone that is breastfeeding full time, your body is typically making a lot of that prolactin, and so that actually causes a delay in a lot of women getting their periods back postpartum. And even though I was exclusively breastfeeding and was always exclusively breastfeeding, it was almost as if my body thought that I wasn't. And so it wasn't creating enough of that hormone prolactin, and the whole like supply and demand thing wasn't really working for me anymore. And so we started to look into options to focus on increasing that hormone of prolactin in my body. I've had a couple of people message me about this over the time that I've been sharing just vaguely about my experience with breastfeeding. The reason I'm so vague about it is because to actually like talk about a medication on my channel for people that are experiencing low supply can be kind of a dangerous thing. Obviously, there are impacts of using this medication that like you could experience if you don't do it properly or for an extended period of time. And so I urge you to please talk to your doctor about this before you start looking into it or trying to do this. But my lactation consultant and my doctor actually prescribed and put me on something called domperidone. So domperidone is actually typically used for other things, but just through research, they found that a byproduct or a symptom of using it is that you could, as a woman, experience an increase in the levels of prolactin in your body. And so they put me on that. Typically, you would take it for like 7 days, and in the first couple of days, you should notice an increase in supply, and then your job after that is to maintain that increase. So you don't actually often need to take it past that 7-day mark, and there can be, again, a lot of dangers and risk associated with taking it for an extended period of time without any breaks. And so we just started with that 7 days and decided to test that out. Around 2 or 3 days into taking this, my supply came back and my letdown was immediate. And it was like this huge weight had been lifted off of my shoulders. My baby loved to breastfeed again. I loved to breastfeed again. It was like we had gotten back into that rhythm that I had around like that kind of 4-week and 2-month mark where everything was going really well with it. And it was just like such a huge relief on me to feel like we had solved the problem and figured out what was happening, and that I didn't have to experience that anxiety anymore. I never got engorged when I was taking the domperidone. It was always just like the perfect amount of supply. But I did start collecting the letdown. So again, that wasn't something I did in the early stages, but because I knew how valuable it would be this time around to have a freezer supply, I started to collect the milk. So I would use a Haka, I would use an Elvie, and just make sure that after I fed her, and I would collect on both sides with each feeding, that I would freeze that milk and save it for later just in case. Basically what ended up happening from like month 5 to probably month 7 or 8 is I would take domperidone every 5 or 7 days leading up to my period for however many days I needed to take it to make sure that I didn't run into that issue with low supply again. So as I mentioned before, sometimes you'll only need to take it for like 7 days just to get to your supply back up, and then you don't need it again. But for myself personally, my supply dipped every single time my period came back, and so we would use it, and of course my doctor knew this and I had a prescription for this, to take it every couple days leading up to my period as much as I needed to just make sure that I didn't experience that drop again. I was honestly so relieved to have a solution that wasn't just like eat oatmeal or look at your baby, because I was just like hearing all that stuff and feeling like I feel like this is not working for me, and for some people that just might not be working for you. Again, like everyone's body is different, and it wasn't those quick fixes that turned it around for me. I ended up having to go get help. I had to admit that like this wasn't working on my own, and so I brought my doctor into it, and I'm so grateful that I did, because it bought me so many more months of being able to breastfeed my daughter that I thought that I wasn't going to be able to have. With that being said, once I kind of got into a healthy rhythm with breastfeeding again, I knew that there was a lot of internal work that I needed to do to be able to not get back to the place that I was before I discovered this solution. I knew that I personally was carrying a lot of mom guilt, a lot of shame, a lot of pride in feeling like I need to be the best mom in the world, and this is the only way that I can actually make sure that I do that for my daughter is by breastfeeding her. I was seeing all of this like fed is best stuff on Instagram, but I would look in the comments to see if anyone had potentially said that breast is best, and just kind of like felt like that was a comment to me, and just felt so just like worked up about being against using formula and wanting to do it the natural way and wanting to do it the way that doctors used to go by the book. And so I just knew that I needed to release a lot of that to God. I needed to pray and work through it and know that like what I ended up doing at the end of the day, whether it was formula or breast milk, like my daughter was going to be okay, and that there didn't need to be any of that pressure and just like unmet expectation for myself. And so I had to, during this time, like even though I was still breastfeeding, focus on praying through it, bringing people into it, and letting a lot of that anxiety go. During that time, my husband and I had a conversation where basically we just agreed that like if I was to ever get to, like, God forbid, that place again of just feeling the anxiety and the weight of it all, that I would choose to formula feed, and that I wouldn't hesitate to do that, because it just wasn't worth the impact it would have on my mental health. And so we decided that kind of while I was still breastfeeding and while things were going well. But thank God that we did have that conversation, because around 7.5 months postpartum with my daughter, I found out that I was pregnant with baby number 2. So one of the reasons why I actually found out that I was pregnant was because I again noticed that dip in my supply. But of course, because that was like clockwork for me every month, I started to take that domperidone again. When I realized that it was not my period and that it was pregnancy, I immediately stopped taking the domperidone. There is a little bit of research that just says that it might not be the safest thing for an unborn baby, and so I was like, I'm not taking this, like I'm gonna stop. And with that, I kind of knew like that would mean that as soon as my supply would like dry up this time, that would be for good. It only took a couple of weeks for me to start needing that freezer supply and dipping into that again. And at that point, I was like, all right, I started to begin mourning the breastfeeding journey just in general, and knowing that it was gonna wrap up soon, and just being a little bit sad that it wasn't able to happen on our own terms, but also just grateful overall for the time that this entire experience was able to buy me of being able to do it for just a little bit longer. So around 8 months of my daughter's life, I introduced formula for the first time. And you guys, she had had bottles of milk before that, but this was the first bottle of formula. And when I gave it to her, I sobbed, but I sobbed happy tears because she took it so well. It was as if she had never had anything else in her life. She was so happy. She finished the bottle and was completely full. And for me, it was just like that final pressure release and just that feeling of like, okay, like you've done it. And nothing fell apart. Like the world is still okay. Everyone is still happy and breathing, and your daughter is fed and you are good. And it was just like that feeling of like, I cannot believe that this is what I was so worked up about this entire time. So after that first bottle at 8 months, over the next 4 weeks, I began that process of slowly weaning her off of the feedings, and I would just kind of drop a feeding at a time and just allow her to take the bottle during that feeding as well. And I didn't get engorged, I didn't get mastitis. My body just kind of slowly stopped creating the milk that it needed for those feedings, and everything was great. It's honestly like so amazing that anyone can feed her, and it was great timing because she ended up going into daycare at like 10.5 months as well, and at that point was already great at taking the bottle, was great with it being formula. And so overall, it was just such an amazing feeling to feel free, and like I finally could just like have a lot of my own life back. And as much as I did miss a lot of that experience with bonding and breastfeeding, and it was such a beautiful thing, the trade-off for my mental health has been definitely more worth it to switch to formula than if I had tried to continue to breastfeed and just get my supply back up again. So I'm sure you might be wondering, like, with that entire whirlwind of an experience, will you breastfeed baby number 2? And the answer is yes. I am going to and plan on breastfeeding baby number 2, and there are a few things that I'm going to do differently with that this time. I think the first thing that I would do differently is make sure that I build a freezer supply at the beginning. So that is my biggest kind of, other than like continuing to carry it on when I didn't need to, my biggest regret was not actually collecting a lot of that milk, and when I was pumping it, putting it in the freezer in the early stages. I wish that I would have collected a lot more of that milk when I could. And this time, if my milk comes in as strong as it did the first time, I will definitely be freezing a lot of that, just to have that backup in case we do need it. The next thing that I will be doing differently this time is taking off the pressure. So of course that's easier said than done, and hormonally you don't know how you're gonna manage when you get there, but personally, just with this experience, I know that I am going to start using formula as soon as I notice that there has been an impact on my mental health this next time. It's honestly just not worth it to be feeling the way that I was feeling a lot of the time when it came to feeding specifically, especially knowing that my daughter was a lot happier and I was a lot happier when she was getting those full bottles of formula at every feeding. So next time I will be certainly taking that pressure off of myself. The next thing that I will do differently is just focus on making it as comfortable as possible for myself right off the bat. So I ended up using a kind of like boppy breastfeeding pillow that I didn't love. I found that it was uncomfortable for me, and so I just stopped using it and ended up just holding her up for a lot of the feedings. But then I developed a lot of wrist pain, and again, like I got really chapped and like dry and cracked nipples right after I started breastfeeding. And I tried to use like this organic cream and just tried to do a lot of the things by the book, or like by Instagram mom rules and all this stuff, and I will not be doing that this next time. I'm gonna make breastfeeding as comfortable as possible, and if I need to find a pillow that works better, I will go and buy the pillow that works better. I am going to right off the hop choose to use the Jack Newman's nipple ointment instead of like these organic natural nipple butters. I bought a natural one and brought it with me to the hospital, but before I left the hospital, I ended up getting a prescription for something called Jack Newman's nipple ointment. That is the one that works. That is the one that will actually heal your nipples before feedings, and it's safe for you, it's safe for baby to actually latch after it's been put on. And so I will be using that immediately next time and will feel absolutely no shame about it. So I guess like to summarize this whole long story, I would just say like, please, if you are a new mom and you are experiencing a lot of this like shame around breastfeeding, or you are about to be a mom and you don't really know what this whole journey is going to look like for you, everyone is different and everyone's unique situation is going to look different, and you can honestly try everything to increase your supply, and it may work for you and it may not. And that was the case for me. Now looking back, I wish that I had just known earlier and sooner that like that didn't equate to me being a failure as a mom. Your mental health at the end of the day is priority. When you are healthy mentally, you can be a much better mom to your baby than you can be if you are running yourself into the ground trying to make this work because you feel shame or you feel pride about it. That just isn't fair for them or for you. I'm interested to see how things go with baby number 2. I'll definitely keep you guys posted when they arrive on how all of it is going and just bring you into that. But I would love to know for you guys what your experience experience with breastfeeding was like, if you had any challenges, what worked for you, whether that was low supply or letdown or engorgement. I'm sure there will be moms all over the spectrum watching this video that have had a different experience, and maybe some moms that have never breastfed before that are just kind of looking to see what to expect. And so be sure to share your tips down in the comments section, and I will also be using them for my second baby. So thank you guys so much for watching. I hope that this could encourage you and just bring some light into your breastfeeding experience as well. If you did enjoy this video, I would love for you to also give it a thumbs up before you head out today. That helps my channel so much and honestly means the world to me. And until my next video, I love you guys. I'm praying for you guys in all of your unique breastfeeding experiences, and I will see you soon.